Hello, I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is going to be a conversation starting with the banning of books in schools. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land in which I am speaking to you tonight is the home of many nations and the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, and they are the Edmonton Public Library, PEN Canada, the Writers Union of Canada, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. Lawrence Hill's novel, Book of Negroes, is one of Canada's widely acclaimed books. It has won the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, CBC Radio's Canada Reads, Radio-Canada's Le Combat des Livres, and also the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, which came with a private audience with Queen Elizabeth II. The Book of Negroes was also made into a television miniseries, which Lawrence Hill co-wrote with director Clement Virgo, and which attracted millions of viewers on the CBC in Canada and on BET in the United States. A miniseries that won many awards, including 11 Canadian Screen Awards and the NAACP Award for Best Writing of a Television Motion Picture. But to a school board in Ontario, it was so unacceptable that the school, this school year, teachers were banned from assigning it. And the teacher who told Hill of the board's decision was placed on paid leave hours after he criticized the move in an essay in the Globe and Mail. Why? Because it had a certain word in it. What does such censorship mean for the education of students? And what larger questions does it raise about the understanding of the role of literature in our society? Discussing this tonight with us will be the Book of Negroes author, Lawrence Hill, in conversation with Debra Thompson. Lawrence Hill, as many of you know, is the author of 11 books of fiction and nonfiction and has won many awards for his writing, some of which I've just named. He's also a playwright, a public intellectual, and a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph. In recognition of his remarkable work, Lawrence has been named a member of the Order of Canada and has been awarded honorary doctorates from 10 Canadian universities. Welcome, Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for hosting this event. Thank you to you and the Center for Free Expression.
We're delighted to have you. Lawrence will be in conversation with Debra Thompson. Debra is Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality and Democratic Societies at McGill University, a leading scholar in comparative politics of race. And she's also a talented author. Her memoir, The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging, was a finalist for the Hilary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for the audience, we're happy to have all of you here. And so Lawrence and Debra are going to be in a conversation for 45, 50 minutes. And then they're going to turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation and to give you an opportunity to ask questions and to have a Q&A session with them. In this version of Zoom, the chat does not function, but if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So when you're listening to the conversation, and if a question comes to mind that you'd like to ask them when we get to the audience part where we bring the audience in, just write the question out as you think of it. And when Debra turns to the audience, she'll ask Ange Holmes, the coordinator of the center, to read out the first question, which she will do, and then the two of them will discuss it, and then she'll ask Ange for the second question, so on. So please, we hope you'll take this wonderful opportunity to ask questions. They're going to be discussing a number of things that I'm sure will interest you and some that will raise important questions. So do make use of that Q&A button and join in the conversation. That's all from me. So I'm going to turn it back to the two of you and looking forward to your conversation.
Thanks so much, Jim. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation between me and my best friend, Lawrence Hill, who I have never met in person, but we're working on changing that soon. Lawrence, hi.
Hey, Deborah, it's really great to speak voice to voice, and delighted to do this with you.
Oh my gosh, I think that we are going to have a great conversation where we agree and disagree and all the things in between. So I'm going to, for the audience out there in the world, welcome. I'm going to ask Lawrence some questions, but hopefully we can have more of a conversation as two folks who think about these issues quite a bit. So let's start. I think the best place to start here is so we are both people who identify as Black. Our audience is probably not just Black people. I hope. I hope that lots of folks have tuned in. Um, are we gonna say that word? Are we? What are we gonna do here? What are the principles and logics behind your choice of whether or not to say that word in this conversation?
Well, Deborah, I think if we were talking privately, just having a conversation or coffee or a beer or something, and we were talking about the word and its use in literature and what's happening to literature that uses the word in schools, of course I would use it if we we're having a conversation about what's going on. Um, but I don't think I really want to use it tonight because we don't know who's listening or who might be offended. And also because I think many educators and teachers will be watching, I'd like to model the concept that you can talk about the word and how fraught it is, how complex it is, and the need to keep teaching books with the word in it without actually using it. And I like to show that we can have that conversation without actually using the word. So, for in this public format, since we really don't know who's listening or how people might be offended by it, I'd rather just play it safe and not use the word, but talk about it as much as we want. What's your inclination? What would you have wanted to do? I'm curious,
Oh,
Deborah.
I knew you're going to turn the mic back on me. So as you know, at least I teach in university settings. I do use the word in an academic context when it calls for it. My personal opinion on who gets to say the word and who doesn't is pretty simple. Mine is that if you are Black and I don't know if any Black person who's my age or older who hasn't been called the word, if you've been called it in a way that's meant to dehumanize you, you get to say it as much as you want. Let me ask you that a question off of that is like what before we get to the situation which we are going to talk about, like what's the big deal? What's the controversy? What do you think is at the heart of the issue around who can and can't say that word and in which context? What do you think's going on? What's your sense?
Well, on one hand, people have learned that it's incredibly offensive to use it in a racially insulting or derogatory way.
People
And of
have
course,
hopefully learned in
most
the year of
many
our Lord
people, I
2025.
think so. And certainly when I was growing up, I mean, I was born in 57. So when I'm growing up in Toronto in the 60s, my father, who was an African American who became a passionate Black Canadian, civil rights activist, he told me that if anybody used the word, and of course I heard it, and it was hurled at me numerous times as a boy, then I should ball up my fists and fight, which is terrible advice, especially for a kid who's small and isn't pugnacious anyway. But so, he taught me that the word was a fighting word, literally. And so I understand its painful history. And of course, for those who don't know, it's not just a word that is a racial insult, but it's associated with violence, torture, rape, murder, you name it. The word accompanied, up to murder, terrible physical violence against Black people over the course of centuries in North America. And so it's not just a word, but a word that accompanied violence. And so it has a painful history, and people are afraid of it. But I think in a way we've given it so much power that now we think we can't even talk about it, which is so Canadian. Americans talk more freely about this word. Black Americans talk more freely and publicly about this word than we do in Canada. And I think we have to have a little more confidence and discuss these things fearlessly. And we don't, I'm more worried about driving while Black or about poor educational opportunities, about poor opportunities in the workplace or in housing than I'm about the word. I mean, let's keep this in context.
Yeah, I like that. I'm quite convinced by the arguments of Ta-Nehisi Coates around this. There's just a great clip that I play for my students. And it's essentially Ta-Nehisi Coates saying, like, when you are born and raised white in the American, and I would argue North American context, you walk through the world without anyone ever having told you no. You walk through the world knowing it is yours to own, knowing there's nothing you can't say, being taught there's nothing you can't do. And that just isn't the experience of growing up Black. We are taught from a very early age that there's lots that is dangerous for us to do, lest it, raise the ire of those folks who have the power to end our lives and livelihoods. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument is that, when white people are told, like, no, there is a word you cannot say, that interestingly is actually kind of like akin to an experience of being Black, but they don't like it.
Yeah, and you're depriving me of my liberties.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. The whiteness as the freedom to use racial slurs. There's a great article by Jefferson Covey that argues something like that. Um, Let me ask you, let me get to the situation that brought us here today. So back in December, you wrote a long op-ed for our friends at the Globe and Mail. And you opened by saying that there is a teacher who called you to say that she and her colleagues had been told not to teach the novel, The Book of Negroes. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of like what happened, what was the aftermath. I wanted to give you a chance to tell us about the situation and your take on it.
Thanks. Yeah, well, she's a very brave and courageous teacher. Her name is Heather Hamilton. She's been teaching for over 30 years in the London District Catholic School Board. She teaches English, in high school, and for many years has been teaching the Book of Negroes. And she's one of, a happy handful, or more than a few happy handfuls of very engaged teachers who want to teach, challenging literature. And she was told in no uncertain terms that she could no longer teach that book or any book to her class, assign the book to her class, because it contained that word. And and of course, she was appalled by this because it means that if you can't teach the book with the word, you're basically not teaching any engaged and serious Black literature. I mean, whether it's Toni Morrison or Essie Adugin or David Cherry-Andy or Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, or anybody else, chances are that serious Black writers will go to that word as part of their lived experience when they're writing fiction or nonfiction or poetry. And so basically, the board is eliminating the class assigned study of serious Black literature. And it takes us back 50 years in time to when I was growing up, and all we read was white male writers. I don't think I was ever assigned a non-white writer to read when I was going through high school, and even in my first year at University of British Columbia, same thing. And so she was appalled, and she came to me, and we had a long conversation about it. She was very vocal about it too, and horrified by basically it is a book ban. Let's not mince words. They've banned the book essentially because they prevented her from teaching it to the class, and within hours of the piece appearing online in the Globe and Mail, the board suspended her with pay, and she remained suspended 2 months after the fact. Yeah.
That seems quite punitive, particularly given that you are the author of the said book. What so let's talk a little bit about the Book of Negroes. It's a book that I used to assign to my classes when it first came out. Interestingly, I was teaching in the States at the time when your book came out, and in the US it was originally known by another name. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was supposed to come out as Book of Negroes in the States. They even had a, advanced reader's copy with a cool cover and the Book of Negroes. And I was on a book tour in Germany, and the book was about to come out in the States. They were about to go to print, to press. And my editor in New York at Norton, W. Norton and Company, called me in Germany and said, "Oh, we have to change the title. We're going to print on Monday. This is Friday. We have to change the title." Why? Because booksellers, major booksellers in the United States, were refusing to stock the book to place advance orders with the word Negroes in the title. And I was horrified, but I understood. And Canadians often fail to understand that in South Chicago or in Brooklyn, the word has a whole different ring on the street, the word Negro, which of course is not the other word that we're avoiding. The word has a whole different ring on the street than, say, it would in Don Mills, Ontario, where I grew up. If you use the word Negro in South Chicago or Brooklyn or something, you're likely to get punched in the nose. It has all sorts of in culture derogatory context, like a pseudo black person who doesn't really respect themselves, that kind of thing. And so Uncle Tom. And so they changed the title at the last minute, and we fought over the weekend, and I finally suggested an alternative title. But when it came out as a miniseries many years later in the States and had all these viewers, it was called The Book of Negroes. Nobody rioted or died or took great offense. And so then the publisher in the States reverted to the original Canadian title, The Book of Negroes. So really, it has two titles now in the States. So that's a short synopsis of what happened to it in the States. Same thing in Australia and New Zealand.
Do you think that they were being overly cautious at the time, or do you think that our culture has evolved a little bit, or a little bit
Well,
of both, or neither?
I was upset because it's terrible for marketing. You don't want to have two different titles of the same book in the same content. It really messes things up in terms of promotion and marketing. People are often thinking they're buying a different book when they're actually buying the same book. Um, and of course, someone knows my name, which is the title in the States. It's like watered down rum compared to the punchiness of the Book of Negroes, which asks the question like, "What is that?" And the question is answered in the book. It's a British naval ledger that records the exodus of 3,000
Which
black.
was literally called the Book of Negroes. It's
Yeah,
not,
it
you didn't
records
make
it.
that up.
No, it records the exodus of 3,000 blacks from New York City to primarily Nova Scotia in 1783. And so it asks the question, and it's more provocative. I think it's an eminently better title than Someone Knows My Name. And so I was upset. But on the other hand, words have different heft in different countries, and definitely like my black cousins in Brooklyn were begging me not to call it the Book of Negroes in the States because they said that their friends would be offended to see that word in the title. And I just shot back and said, well, if you read into the book, you'll find out why it's called that. And so I want to hang on to the title. But they were troubled, and they're very progressive, literate, you know, people who see the world pretty well the same way I do. But the word has, I think, had a different resonance, say in Brooklyn, than it would have had in Don Mills or or uh, in really pretty any Canadians, pretty well any Canadian city.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The labels that we use to define identities obviously change over time. And one of my early empirical works was on changing census categories. And
Mm.
the United States actually just changed the category Black to not have the word Negro. Originally, well, originally it was a lot of things, but in the year 2000 and 2010, the category Black was Black, African American, or Negro, because folks like my grandmother, who passed away in 2006 or seven, would have no problem with the descriptor Negro, but somewhere along the line, that generation passed away, moved on, and now I think that there's a new resurgence of the label when used ironically. What do you make of these arguments that using words or like there's a reclamation of words? What do you make of those arguments that they're now when a dominated group reclaims a word that was once used to oppress, it's actually subversive? What's your sense of that? What's your take on that?
Well, I'll answer, but I'll say playfully that the children of my cousins in Brooklyn, so there's a family that lives, has been living for decades in Flatbush in Brooklyn. The children sometimes use that playfully the term magic Negro, which suggests a black person who's moved magisterially into the upper middle class. That's a magic Negro, and which is I think kind of hilarious. But
Whenever it's too cold, my brother and I text, it's TCFN, which means too cold for Negroes, because there's a reason. It's because historically, Canadian immigration policy denied entry to Black people on the basis that our climate was in fact too cold for Negroes.
yes, absolutely.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's a reclamation of the language happening now.
Well, I mean, it's not just black folks. I mean, look at the evolution of the word queer, for example, or all sorts of words to describe female genitalia. Like, all sorts of words evolve according to who's using them and who's reclaiming what. But I think that that I try to talk to my students about how there is no language that evolves more kaleidoscopically than the language that purports to define a person by race, because it will never satisfy. So, we've gone from the most insulting terms, the colored, NAACP, Negro, Black, African American. I remember asking my grandmother, who was born in 1896, how she liked to be called, and she said, I don't like Negro, I'm an Afro American. And it was the first time I actually heard that term. I was quite young, Afro American. And it was exciting and new to me to hear her say that. And people will never be happy with terms that ultimately will fail because they're trying to pin something on a person that's an arbitrary and fallacious description. And the terms that describe people by race will always fail because they're ludicrous. And so we're always going to be searching, and our great grandchildren will laugh at the language that we're using today. I wish I could be around to hear what they'll be saying, So, yeah, language is always evolving, and language that purports to define us racially will always fail. So, of course, it keeps changing.
So let's talk a little bit about I for one am struck by how the scope of these debates is once again happening in education, in schools, in libraries, in what the core curricula is. And these debates are not just about the use of a word, it's about what is appropriate to teach and learn. And of course, that I think is indicative of who we think we are as a society, and who we should be. To look very briefly towards the whatever's happening south of the border, President Trump recently issued an executive order ending, quote, the radical indoctrination in K to 12 schooling. Um, Without getting into that, why do you think these debates are happening in K to 12 education? What's at stake, and why is it important?
Well, when people try to ban or censor books, it's almost always aimed at books that would be consumed by children, people who are still in school. People don't usually care that much about a book that somebody who's 35 years old will read. I mean, there are sometimes ridiculous attempts to ban or burn books, and of course, burning books and banning books is often a prelude to genocide. Let's be clear. The Nazis burned books, the leaders of the Spanish Inquisition burned books as they were going about killing people. So it's a hideous prelude often to violence to burn books and to ban them. But I mean, you mentioned the States, and I too don't want to go too far down that road. But in the States, you often have that exact phenomenon where books are being banned from being used in school because they explore issues of race or racial history or racial identity. Those books are verboten now in many places in the United States, and it's very scary. But the flip side of the same coin, which is equally dangerous, is when Canadian educators purport to be protecting students from harm, which is the language of the London District Catholic School Board, by banning the teaching of books that contain these words. And even if the volition is positive, even if they claim to be seeking to protect students from harm, the effect is the same, which is to eliminate Black writers and other writers, other racialized writers, from the classroom. And it takes us back 50 years in time when students really will only be able to read white writers. Because if you're Indigenous or South Asian or a Black and you're writing authentically about your lived experience, fictionally or non fictionally, you're likely to use that word. Or use a word that is a racial slur that is part of your lived experience. And I would also say that it's so ludicrous because I mean, we could talk about this, but kids hear the word 15 times a day, going to school, coming back from school, calling each other the word, listening to hip hop music, watching movies, watching TV, and suddenly we're protecting them in the 45 minutes or the hour and a half they're in school because there they can't see the word. Heaven forbid it would cause them harm. The same word that they hear 15 times a day going to and from school. So it's kind of a ludicrous conceit that we're protecting students from harm when they're hearing the word all the time. The harm is in not discussing the word and its history and its place in the English language and its place in literature. The harm is avoiding the conversation and sort of abdicating our educational obligations as teachers.
So that's a great segue. You're a teacher. I'm a teacher. We teach, or at least I teach. I teach students who are obviously much older than those in K to 12 education, thankfully. But hats off to you all who teach young people. My father did, and like I cannot imagine. Um, do you think folks in the K to 12 education system, like, are teachers prepared to have those conversations and to do it well? I haven't been a high school student for a long time, but the only Black teacher I laid eyes on was my father. And so I worry about a profession which is still dominated by, frankly, white women, and their ability to have these difficult conversations and to do it well. What's your sense?
That's a great question. I was chatting about this yesterday with a good friend of mine, Carl James, who's a well-known Black sociologist and educator who talks often about these issues. A really wonderful man, and we were chatting about this very thing. And I said, Carl, like, let's imagine in 20 years' time. Do you really think that the majority of white educators will suddenly be so much more advanced than they are today that they're suddenly all prepared to teach Brother by David Cheriandy or Washington Black by S.A. Durgin or Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King? Will they suddenly be so much more aware and informed that the world would be perfect that they can all teach freely? And of course, we both laughed and said, of course they won't. Some teachers will be as poorly equipped in 20 years as they are today. So what are we going to do? Do we wait for pedagogical perfection before we introduce children? Again, we're not talking about young children. We're talking about 16, 17-year-old people here. Before we introduce teenagers to challenging literature, do we wait for perfection in pedagogy? Well, in that case, they'd never be taught anything. They'd never be taught anything about the Holocaust. They'd never be taught anything about major world issues if we waited for perfection. So some teachers, I think, are well prepared. I mean, I've met many teachers, such as Heather Hamilton, who take their work really seriously and who really strive to contextualize the history and the social settings of the books that they teach, including the Book of Negroes. Some teachers won't, but students learn from the text. They learn from each other. They learn from their own conversations. They're not just learning from the teacher, and many students will surpass the teacher, frankly, in their brilliance, in their understanding, in their intellect, in their ability to read deeply into things. And so I don't think we can wait for perfection before we teach challenging literature, or we'll never teach it. But what would you say? I mean, I understand that lots of teachers aren't as prepared as we'd like them to be. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think so my undergrads come in my classroom, and I have to say, since I came back to Canada, I came back in 2020, I've been really impressed with the sophistication of my students in the classroom. And it's such a different situation than when I left Canada in 2010. When I left in 2010, no one was talking about white privilege. Like that was not a concept that people, even in the academy in Canada at least, were talking about. And of course, I left Canada because I could not get a job in this country because Obama was president and racism was apparently over in 2008. And now that I'm back in Canada, I remember being like so really impressed with the level of sophistication of my students and their knowledge of concepts like settler colonialism. Certainly, their understanding of the permanence of settler colonialism and the violence it has done to Indigenous people is really so much better than it was, 10, 15 years ago. Their knowledge of race is not quite there. It's really it's not they haven't had the same level of education. I don't think there's been the same level of attention to issues of race and racialization. Um, but there is, I think, a real willingness to learn on the part of students. Like my classes are oversubscribed. Like I have to turn students away. Sometimes it's standing room only. And I teach at McGill, and most of my students are white. And that to me is just so heartening to see so many folks who want to learn. And it's to me it's unfortunate that they only get to start learning about it in university. I could do so much more if they just had a more solid base of understanding.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I teach at the University of Guelph, and my students too seem to have very advanced knowledge of the concepts you were mentioning earlier. but also many of them have never read a Black writer before I started signing Black literature. Many of them have never heard of what a slave narrative is, or don't even understand that the slave narratives are the foundation of all, Black literature, say in published literature in the world, and so I'm struck to see many of them have never read a memoir of any sort by a Black writer or a work of fiction, and so but they're hungry and they come to it and they want to learn and they're moving fast, and so that I find that heartening too.
Yeah, yeah, they will. And, I think that I know there's a lot of teachers in the audience. And what you said about, I think that the greatest pride of a teacher is that we have students who become smarter than us. Like that's my goal. That's great. I love that. I hope for that. I hope that one day somebody who will challenge everything I write comes through my classroom. That's the point of education.
I
Um,
still remember my grade 1 teacher, Mrs. Rowe, who was just fantastic. I still remember my grade 12 teacher, Mr. Gutteridge. They were just amazing teachers, and a great teacher, you'll carry that experience like a friend in your heart for the rest of your life if you've had the benefit of a fantastic high school or elementary school teacher. It's a hugely significant job, and so that's why I'm horrified that frightened administrators and boards of education are preventing teachers from doing their job, doing the hardest part of their job, which is to introduce challenging literature to their students, and also if these books with words that are racially offensive in them, if they can't be discussed openly and freely in class, where exactly are these students going to have a civilized, respectful, safe conversation where they can treat each other well, where they can really probe these issues? Come on, it's not going to happen on the street corner going in and out of a convenience store. Where will these conversations take place if we can't encourage them in school? So it's a typically Canadian response to run and hide rather than embracing your educational obligations.
yeah. Yeah. I want to speak a little bit about university settings, actually. So in colleges and universities across the country, there is and has been for some years a swirl of controversy over trigger warnings in our syllabi and some pushback against the idea that our classrooms are or should be safe spaces. There's also very real debates about free speech and academic freedom and the limits of both. What do you think of what's happening around these debates? So, like, should controversial or even racist speakers be allowed to present their ideas on college campuses? Do students and faculty have the right to protest those ideas and even shut down the events? Where do you view the line between free speech and hate speech, and what's the relationship that literature has to that blurry line?
I would follow Canadian law.
Mm,
We have laws in this country about hate speech. In terms of what a university decides in terms of who it will invite as, say, a special speaker or an invited speaker, I'd follow the rules of Canadian law. If that speaker is advocating, is violating the hate laws that are in our country, then I would say don't invite them. But if they're
mm,
inside the that limit, and if they're not, if they couldn't be accused, or if they haven't been accused of violating hate laws, I'd say that uh, they should be invited, as offensive as they are, because the flip side of that is not inviting anybody and not inviting the sorts of people that you and I would want to invite. And so I think we should be governed by Canada's hate laws in deciding who gets to come. On the other hand, of course, students have the right to scream and shout and drown out a speaker if they're saying things that are offensive. Well, that's free speech too, that acceptable level of free speech. And anyway, we don't have free speech in this country. We're not allowed to stand up on the street corner and shout fire, or get up in a theater and shout fire. Well, there are limits to speech in Canada. So I think those same limits should be applied to who gets to be invited to universities, even though I will be appalled by some of the people who might be invited and by the things that they say. And even though I cherish the right of students and others to protest what they say and to scream and shout and make all sorts of noise and be civilly disobedient, um, uh, I don't want to start seeing people that I dislike, whose words I dislike, be prevented from speaking at universities. What is your take on that, Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, I think civil disobedience, I'm a big fan of civil disobedience, generally speaking. I absolutely, I believe that controversial speakers should be allowed to speak on college campuses, and I think that people should be allowed to protest when that happens. I also take great pains in my teaching and my work, uh, um, to focus on, like, it sounds very like social sciencey, but like to focus on data. Like I don't need to resort to polemics. Like I can take down Jordan Peterson based on data. Like for real, like the charlatans out there, it falls apart in the face of data. I have a piece coming out in the Globe and Mail on Saturday about the backlash to DEI. And one of the arguments I make is that, like, all those people who hate DEI, y'all don't know what it is. You don't know what it means in the Canadian context. It's all rhetoric, it's in the arguments in support of this backlash, or it's all straw men, like, so we don't need to resort to polemics, to politics. We have the data that we need to make the arguments about what needs to be done to achieve substantive equality in this country. And so I say, like, yeah, let them talk, because it's pretty easy to tear down those arguments.
Yeah.
Whether or not we want to, whether or not we have the energy to, is another story.
Yeah, it's hard. And it's obviously makes one squirm when somebody's invited to speak who's spouting ideas that are, anathema to us. But the alternative is more troubling. And so we have to
Yeah,
really,
let me talk about the alternatives a little bit here. So I'm trying to thread together these thoughts. So on the one hand, we have the school board, which has banned a book that is meant to open conversations about social justice and racism, and the origins of this very, very deep history of anti-Black racism in the country. On the other hand, we have a contemporary circumstance where, when we talk about censorship, the loudest voices who are talking about censorship right now are on the right, and their goals are frequently not to have these substantive conversations about systemic racism in our country. The the talk of censorship these days is about, you know, it's about Facebook. It's about, should the government um control what mis and disinformation we consume? Do you see these things as separate issues? Do you see them as connected? I can't quite make the connection in my mind, but they seem to be similar, dealing with similar issues.
well, I'm not sure if I'm getting right to the nub of your point, so help me if I'm missing it a little bit. But I, in a sense, and it comes back to something I think we were touching on earlier, efforts on the right to prevent the discussion in schools or the introduction of books in schools that explore issues of race or identity or racial injustice, those efforts are from the right, let's say, are meeting efforts from, let's call the left, or let's call people who profess to be progressive, to ban books and to ban the teaching of books that have racially offensive language in them. But their effect is the same, which is to ban conversations in entire classes about these issues, to ban the study of literature that explores serious issues relating to race and racial injustice in Canadian history. And so it's a hideous situation where the right and the left are meeting in their book banning efforts, and it's really quite troubling. And I think that the only like it's important to remember that when a teacher wants to actually teach a book that is challenging, let's say that uses racially charged language relating, let's say, to Black people. And again, it's not just my book, but it's a book by any Black person who's writing about these issues. Um, when when a board decides to prohibit this, they're prohibiting the discussion of issues. They're not just protecting students from a word. And so they're eliminating conversations that need to be had in schools and might not be had anywhere else.
Yeah. I have just a couple more questions. I'd like to remind everyone listening that you are free to ask your own questions of Lawrence Hill and me, I guess, but more importantly, Lawrence Hill, in the Q&A box, and we would love to hear from you and get your take on this conversation. So shall we talk about Quebec? Salut tout le monde, qui vient.
Salut tout le monde.
So I live in Montreal. I work in Quebec. We know that the word nigger has a different connotation in the Quebec context, particularly for those who don't know the history. Pierre Valliere is a very famous Quebecois nationalist who wrote an essay and then a book in 1968 with the title "The Nègres Blancs d'Amérique," the White Niggers of America, which was a really important text in the Quebec sovereigntist movement in the 1960s, 70s, and through to now. And the tone and tenor of this debate over that word has a different flavor in Quebec. What's your take on the situation?
By the way, I gave that book in translation. My dad didn't speak French, but I gave that book to my dad in translation. When I was living in Quebec City, going to Université Laval. I went there in the late '70s up till about 1980 when I graduated, and so I gave that book to my dad. And the book actually ticked me off, not because of the word. I wasn't the least bit troubled about the title of the book, because I didn't like the fact that it equated the treatment of the Quebecois in Canada to the treatment of, say, African peoples in the Americas. And I thought that was such a stretch that it was offensive, to equate slavery to what had happened, to people in Quebec, even though I was myself a nationalist. And I myself, if I'd been a Quebecois, I probably would have voted We've in the first referendum of 1980. But even with my sympathies with the nationalists as a young student, you know how it is when you're 22 years old, I was offended by the equation of those things.
Yeah, it's a really problematic argument for anyone who's interested in folks who have written on the problematic comparison. I would direct you to the work of Sean Mills or David Austin, who have written pretty extensively on the history of Black folks in Canada and in Quebec in particular. Yeah, it's a really problematic comparison, and yet in Quebec there is like a really an adamant sense that like white people, and in particular like white francophones, absolutely have the right to say that word. And the argument is that the translation of nègre in French isn't quite
It's harsh.
isn't quite as harsh. And then the accusation is that it is Anglophones trying to anglicize or like impose an English debate where it doesn't belong. What do you think?
Well, it's so interesting. Well, first of all, speaking French myself, I agree that the word nègre does not translate directly, into the other word. I agree that it's not a direct hit in terms of translation. Just like, there is no satisfactory word in French that would sort of get the tenor, the North American and the African American tenor of the word Negro. There's no good word in French that really evokes the tone and the deeper meaning, the shades of meaning of the word Negro in French. And so it's hard when you're moving between languages. But just because the word doesn't have quite the insulting smack in the face, in French that it does in English, doesn't mean that it's not incredibly problematic, and doesn't mean that a Black person walking down the streets, of Montreal isn't going to be really offended if somebody calls him, en sale nègre or something like that as they're walking by. So come on, the word's been used often in the history of French, in the history of the French language in Quebec, as a very offensive word. It's highly offensive. So if it's a couple shades less offensive than the other word, who cares? It's still offensive.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think so.
And it's true.
It no,
The white liberal progressive often progressive artists like people in Quebec, in my experience, also I agree with you, will tell me that they don't want to be restricted in what they can say, and they should feel free to use these words. Nobody's going to tell them, what words they can use and not use, and it's a very different feeling on the street among artists and intellectuals in Quebec, in my experience with my French friends and so forth, than it is, in English, but also, a number of black writers that I know and others in Quebec will proudly use the word. And a little bit like you were saying in the intro, they'll say, well, since I've been called the word 1,000 times, why can't I use it and reappropriate it in the way that I damn well please? And so,
Mhm.
and I find that people in Quebec who are black, who are in the arts, are less afraid of the word than, say, people, in Toronto or Vancouver who are black, who might be asking themselves whether they can use the word in English.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially considering in Quebec there's a real hesitancy to talk about anything about race in Quebec. You know, Francois Legault, the premier of Quebec, has said so many times that there is no systemic racism in Quebec, in spite of the many reports that detail systemic racism in the health system and certainly in the police. And it's really an interesting well, it's an interesting province, and also it's an interesting challenge to those of us who are take into account that there are these slippery translation issues, is culturally translation issues of translation that don't quite mesh as well as the Anglophone Canadian to Anglophone American context. And yet still, racism in Quebec is very real. Certainly some of the controversies we've seen in recent years over the use of blackface and the defense of blackface in the Quebec context, to me, is wild. It's such a strange, wonderful place. Please don't run me out of town.
Well, I too love Quebec, and I too am troubled, just as I am in Ontario, where I live. But there are some beautiful things and amazing things, and there's also very troubling trends and things happening too, including, as I mentioned, in the London District Catholic School Board. But sure, many Quebecois don't even know about Marie-Joseph Angelique, who's tortured and burned, and murdered, in the streets of Montreal in 1734 because she's accused of having burned down the home of her putative owner. Uh, in the violence and the history of slavery, in Quebec is something that's very little known by most people in Quebec. And I agree with you. That translates right up to the present day, when the denial of racism seems more emphatic, in Quebec than it is, say, in Ontario or British Columbia. I don't particularly believe that it's any worse in Quebec than in Ontario in terms of the demonstration of racism. I just think that the denial of it is more emphatic.
Yeah, yeah. So I believe my call for questions has been successful. It seems like we have quite a few, so I will stop monopolizing your time. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a question, that would be lovely.
Yes, we do have quite a few questions. The first question, somebody says, I'm dealing with this at a PhD level. I was told during my annual progress review that although the word Negro, not the N-word, was used by Black authors, I should use other words. As a professor of creative writing, what advice would you give to students facing censorship and arbitrary vilification of works?
Thank you. I'll be happy to take that. I just want to quickly say that for those of you who don't know, The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging by Debra Thompson is a fantastic book. I so enjoyed reading it, and it explores life in Quebec. It explores the duality of living in the States and Canada and sort of coming to terms with and exploring one's own blackness. So I highly recommend it for those of you who haven't seen it. Coming back to the question, um, I think many students that I meet, because I frequently go into high schools, even though I'm not a high school teacher, I'm a university professor. I'm frequently invited into high schools, and many students today, in my experience, have no idea about just exactly what the word Negro is. And many students think that the word Negro is the same as, or pretty well the same as, the other word. And so I have to sort of begin often conversations by saying that you need to understand that while N-word, we'll just say, has a historic association with violence and hatred and vituperation against black people, that the word Negro, right through, say, the early 70s was used proudly by African Americans and African Canadians as a word that was considered neutral and self respecting. And that it's not really until the rise of the Black Power movement that people start naturally moving away from that word and embracing words that seem more prideful, such as Black or African Canadian or Afro American or whatever. And many students don't understand that the word Negro is not based in its tenor, in its general connotations on the street, in the same kind of basin of hatred that the other word is. And so I need to start by contextualizing the difference between those words. Even though they have a very similar etymology, they have a very different sound on the street and meaning. What would you say about that, Deborah?
I mean, I am not a professor of creative writing. I'm a professor of political science. And if my PhD students were using Negro in their work, it would be one, very confusing as to why exactly, unless they were doing something kind of like about political history. And two, I can't imagine anyone in political science having a problem with that, like, or because I imagine it would be in the context of evaluating, texts or public
Yeah.
opinion, or, so if whoever that PhD student is, email us and we'll
Mm-hmm.
see what we
Well,
can do to help you.
and when I heard the question, I was assuming that the word Negro, obviously, we're not using that in common parlance
No.
colloquially these days. So I was assuming that the word was being used in reference to documents or to literature or to previous usage of the word. I was assuming that the writer wasn't using the word kind of loosely without thought. And if that is indeed the case, I can't understand why any word, including the more offensive word, couldn't be used in exploring historical or political or literary issues. If we're exploring the word, let's explore the word. And so, by all means, the questioner can send us a note, but I wouldn't want to see any serious student impeded from exploring those words, especially in a historical context, in their work.
And we will take the next question at your leisure.
Okay. The next question is from Terry. Terry says, I've written a memoir of my white parents' involvement in the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s. I've mentioned the N-word in full, that we were called N-lovers. I also quote a magazine article which included the N-word. I'm white, but I'd like to keep the full N-word in my manuscript. To change it to N-word, I think, is to give it more power. I've never used it as an epithet, nor do I use it that way in the manuscript. What are your thoughts on this?
Deborah, do you want to go first?
I mean, my thought is that quotations are, when you quote primary source material, you quote primary source material. And changing the primary source material is like the cardinal sin of empirical research.
I agree. I agree. If you're using the word in a context, just as the questioner asked, then I think you should use the word.
Yeah. Sorry,
We,
and I feel like we've answered that. Yes, yes. Questioner, you have permission of Lawrence Hill to use the word. Put that in a footnote in your manuscript. And we would love a next question, please.
Okay, the next question, the attendee says, Deborah more or less said she felt if you were Black and had been called the word, then you can use it. What about secondary students on a school campus? Is it fair to say the word will not be used by anyone on a high school campus, regardless of background, to ensure that no one has to face the harm of its use, and to ensure non-Black students do not feel its use is okay because they hear it from some people?
That's
This is
such
a
a great
great,
question. I
yeah.
was just talking with a friend yesterday who was telling me about a Black student who was kicked out of school for a day, suspended for a day because he'd used the word, not as a racial insult, but he'd use the word casually, in school. And I think that often the first mistake is to think we're going to punish a 16-year-old kid for having used the word when it was really quite innocent and playful and not intended to be insulting or harmful. So, I mean, I don't think that I mean, listen, when you meet your grandmother, over the kitchen table, are you going to use some rude word to describe, you know, genitalia, male or female? You're probably not, because you know that there's just certain things you don't do, and in certain places where you should use words, and other places where you don't. And the same thing goes for a classroom. In a place where you don't know how a certain word will resonate, you don't know how offensive certain people might find it. Um, you have to take a safe route. Are you going to shout out a really, really rude word on a bus? Well, I would teach my own children never to use a really, really rude word, loudly on a bus, unless truly the situation required it, like to defend themselves against an attacker or something. Um, you just have to sort of use words with mindfulness about their heft and their meaning. And so I don't think it's wise or can be encouraged to use the word loosely in school settings. But on the other hand, we don't want to overreact, and punish, especially some black kid because they were fooling around calling their buddies that word. What do you say, Deborah?
Yeah, yes, I agree with what you said, absolutely. Um, this is a circumstance, my answer is gonna not be feasible, as a policy. But, like, look, like, when you treat everyone the same, that can result in inequality. So these blanket policies that are like zero tolerance, nobody can say the N-word under any context, it's going to disproportionately harm Black kids,
Yeah.
right? Because they are the ones who use it more colloquially. So those blanket policies in and of themselves are racist, and so my take on this is I think the same as yours, Lawrence, which is like, why the punitive measures, like why did this not start with a conversation about contextualizing the word? Like, is that so hard for administrators to do? And if it is, maybe you shouldn't be an administrator. Like, if hard things are hard to do for you, then you should not be in that job.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I think that many administrators, including many Black administrators, get that fully. I've had conversations like, say, Karen Murray, a wonderful leader, Black educator in the Toronto District School Board, totally gets that and talks about how we don't want to overreact when some teenager is fooling around in the hallway. It's an opportunity to talk. It's an opportunity to teach that student how harmful or offensive that may be to another person who happens to be walking by while the word is heard. It's an opportunity to have a conversation that needs to be had. But absolutely, we don't want to overreact and start kicking kids out of school, primarily Black kids, because they've used the word playfully. So we need to be very mindful about this. And when these things happen, which they will, to use them as opportunities to educate rather than to
Absolutely.
punish.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will take another question.
Okay, the next question is from John. And John asks, would it be fair to say that when boards and schools try to ban the Book of Negroes, they claim it's to avoid offending stakeholders and students, but in fact, they don't want to open a can of worms when students start asking questions about the history of terms like Negro and its roots in slavery and oppression?
That they don't want to open a can of worms by discussing some of these difficult issues relating to the word and its history. Was that the bottom part of the question?
Yes, when students start asking questions about this.
I
Yeah,
think
like it's
that
like I think the heart of the question is like, is it easier to just ban rather than to engage in like a very long, complicated history?
of course, and also teachers are afraid. If the school principal and the superintendent and the Ministry of Education in your province does not have your back, and if you're all alone in being courageous enough to teach a challenging book, and then some parent starts screaming and shouting, and how dare you use a book with this word in it, or some student takes offense, then you're kind of left hanging out to dry, because the leaders in your school board and in your school, they do not have your back. And so it's actually an act of courage for a teacher to teach a book like this if they feel that senior administrators and leaders in the educational system will not support them. And so of course, it's easier to say, well, we won't talk about these books, which is exactly what the school boards are doing. But that takes us back 50 years in time to when the only things that are being read are books by white writers that don't ever explore these issues. Um, and basically that eliminates conversations about these issues and about these books from schools. And again, it's not just Black writers who will be affected by this, but it's also Indigenous and South Asian writers and queer writers and others, who will use language that they've grown up with, that they know about, that it is offensive to them, but that they're using in the context of their own works of drama or nonfiction or poetry.
Yeah, if I could add to that, you know, everything I know about race and racism and systemic racism, like I learned. And I am not particularly anything, I'm not particularly smart. I'm not particularly magical. And these conversations are hard. They are really hard to have. And you can do it. You like people who are out there listening now, like everything I know, I learned, I read, and granted, I did a PhD, so I had some time to read and it was my job to read. But there's no magic to this. There's no mystery to this. If you read and talk to folks who have studied these issues, take a class if you can, like these conversations, you can learn how to do this well. It is entirely possible.
Yes, I agree. And, when a teacher assigns to a whole class the study of a book, it's a teacher's responsibility to learn about the history and the social context about the book, to learn something about the author, and to begin to explore and to contextualize and to prepare students for the reading of these books by saying, listen, these are the realities of the time. This is what was happening at the time. These are the historical underpinnings of this novel. Let's discuss this and let's kind of understand. You're going to encounter a lot of offensive language in this book, and you need to understand that this was a language that was used by the characters at the time. A teacher needs to do the work. I agree, it's not magical, but it does take legwork, and you can't sort of teach a challenging book, whether it's David Cherry Andy's brother, or whether it's a letter from Birmingham jail, or Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Debra Thompson's book. You can't teach a challenging book unless you contextualize it and do the work and do the legwork. So it's not
And it's
magical, but it's just homework.
yeah, it's homework, and it's worth it. I know that the teachers are very, very busy. They have a million kind of pulls on their time. But it's absolutely it's worth it to do that legwork in order to have these conversations and to do it well. And we will take another question when you are ready.
Okay, the next question, an attendee says, I currently am working with predominantly white teachers who are afraid to teach or touch the history of Black or radicalized populations with the fear that they are going to get canceled for saying the wrong thing. What would you say to these educators?
I think that's a widely held fear. I think that, listen, like if you think they're going to be attacked by a student or by a parent, and then not defended by your principal or by your school board superintendent or by directors from, say, the Ontario Ministry of Education or whatever, then it's only normal to be fearful. And so I think the first thing we need is leadership, from provincial governments and their ministries of education or departments of education, and from school board superintendents and from principals of schools saying, we recognize that literature is challenging. We recognize that sometimes it will be painful. Of course, it's painful. Literature is meant to cause a deep thought and to disturb and to provoke interrogations among its readers. But we also recognize the value of teaching our children to think about the world and to muddle through complicated and difficult and painful things. So we are committed to teaching books that reflect, among other things, the racial diversity of this country, and the presence of Black people in this country, and we're committed to do that. And when you have that leadership from the top, I think teachers will feel a lot safer in taking the chance to do it. But it's a fear that I hear widely expressed. Um, People are naturally afraid because they feel that that the leadership in their school boards and schools will not support them if something goes awry.
Yeah, and I would add that this is the purpose of unions. Really, this is the purpose of this is why the teachers union exists and is powerful, precisely to help have those protections. And unions have a very, very complicated history with racism in this country and others. And so, in addition to provincial leadership and leadership at the school board level, I would encourage those folks who are involved in teachers unions to be ready to step up to defend their members in these circumstances.
I don't know if you'll agree, and I don't expect you to agree, Deborah, but I'm very pro-union. But I think unions in Canada have a long history of completely avoiding issues of racial discrimination and racism. And often, if there is a conflict between teachers and school boards, for example, we'll find a way around that issue, typically Canadian approach, rather than meeting it head on. So I'm not confident that today even many unions will embrace and challenge issues of racial discrimination and racial prejudice in trying to defend their teachers. So I'm not optimistic that this is happening today, even though it should be.
Yeah, me too. So if there's people in the union who are listening, we encourage you to do better. And we would take another question.
Yeah, the next question, if a teacher has chosen to teach a book in grade 9 to 12 with the N-word, what are some instructional practices that you would suggest? I.e. teach history of word, not read the word out loud, give parameters for using word outside the class, etc.
Do you want to go first, Deborah?
Yeah, gosh, it's been a long time since I was in a high school classroom. Do you all read aloud in class? Like, is that a thing? This is so very different than university level education. But I would say at the very outset, then there needs to be like a careful guided conversation about the historical context and the use of the word, and an opportunity for students to ask questions and have them answered. In my classroom, we do quite a bit of collaborative work like that. I believe that students are co-teachers and co-learners. That sounds kind of like frou-frou, but really it enables my students to get a say in the material that they're learning, and they're much more likely to be engaged with it because they help me decide the content of the syllabus and other issues. But I think from the outset, I would just have a conversation with my students to gauge where they are and what they think, and to kind of carefully guide that conversation to a place where folks understand the importance of using the word in the appropriate context, and the harm that could come from using it flippantly.
Well, I think we might have a slightly different approach, Deborah. But say when I'm teaching creative writing to undergrads at the University of Guelph, often, well, weekly, I will assign writings by published writers that students will read and reflect on as they work on their own creative writing. So say one week I'm assigning a short story or a memoir by James Baldwin, for example, and say the story or the memoir contains the word, which of course it will if you're reading James Baldwin. Then first of all, even if I ask a certain student or ask students to read little segments aloud just to get a sense of the power of this sentence or how this paragraph is working, I wouldn't ever assign a sentence or a paragraph with that word. I just assign something else to be. If we're going to admire the poetry of a sentence, I wouldn't choose one with that word. And also, we have a conversation beforehand about the word and say, listen, the word's going to appear in this book. This is its history. This is why it's so harmful and so hurtful historically to so many people. But on the other hand, you hear it used all the time. But even if you're hearing it used on your way to university or back home and you're listening to hip hop or whatever, we're not going to use it in class because it's just too much for many people. So we're going to have a conversation about this now, and these are some of the tenors of the word, but we're not going to use it in class. But you're going to see it on the page, and nobody's going to ask to read it aloud. And so we do set some parameters for behavior in the class. And I think, Deborah, you said that you will use the word in class. I don't. Uh, Partly because I think it could land me in a lot of trouble, even at the University of Guelph, even though I'm a tenured professor, if I did use the word, and I don't want that trouble. But also because I don't really feel it's necessary, to examine a work by, say, James Baldwin or Martin Luther King or Essia Dujan. I don't really need to say the word aloud in order to examine the issues that they're presenting in their texts.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, there are so few circumstances in which I would need to say the word. It does come up because I teach American politics as
Yeah.
well. I teach American Black politics, so it certainly comes up. But there aren't a ton of circumstances when it is absolutely required. And I certainly wouldn't, some of the controversy around the professor at the University of Ottawa who used the word, and there was a big deal. And from my understanding of that controversy is that she was quite flippant about it. And that's not that's not how I would approach that. It's not a flippant thing. It's to be taken quite seriously because it does harm to some people. Anyway, um, and shall we take another question?
Sure. Yeah. The next question is from Mike. Mike says, I'm also a teacher in Ontario, and I've heard school boards say they want us to teach novels that celebrate Black joy. I have never been given that direction regarding white authors, nor do I think any novel worth anything is a mere joyful romp. Is an employer asking teachers to teach Black joy racist, demeaning, dismissive? Can you provide examples of novels that celebrate Black joy?
Okay. I've had a chance to think about this. I see Deborah smiling too. I think that is the most ludicrous and ridiculous and condescending thing you could possibly say. First of all, it insults writers. Are you telling me that Aminata in the Book of Negroes has no joy, does not experience Black joy, even though she also experiences a great deal of trauma in her life in and out of slavery? Uh, most novels that I read that I love combine joy with trauma. That's the whole point, is to write about the human experience, the pain and the laughter. And so to suggest that we focus on books that 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 celebrate Black joy, what exactly are you talking about? Are you saying that Martin Luther King has no acquaintance with joy, that his resilience and his approach to being jailed in Birmingham uh, doesn't reflect the joy of his spirit? Are you saying that that's not present already in works by Black writers? It just seems like a very condescending way to talk to people about Black literature, and to suggest that there's a lack of dimensionality and depth and humanity in these very books that we feel should be taught. What do you think, Deborah?
I do not read so much of literature right now because so much of it is in fact a bummer. I study race for a living. I study racism for a living, and so my go-to is always like science fiction, because at least that's not this world. I know enough about trauma in this world, and so I would like to see any books that are only about joy that aren't meant for children. This seems to me that Canadian literature and American literature is about the entire spectrum of the human experience. That's what makes it literature, is it not?
I mean, well, if you like sci-fi, even Kindred by Octavia Butler, I think as hard hitting as it is, I think there's a lot of joy in that book too. And so again, to suggest that these serious works of literature don't contain joy and laughter and resilience and humanity is to diminish the depth of the literature, and also is to underestimate the intelligence of the students in high school, who are perfectly capable of picking out resilience and laughter and joy as they also read about injustice and trauma.
And we will take another question.
Yeah, the next question. In talking about banned books, would you differentiate which books with the word in it should be taught? For example, would you differentiate a book such as To Kill a Mockingbird from a book like the Book of Negroes?
And Deborah, do you want to take that first?
I mean, I have not read To Kill a Mockingbird in a long time. Was it assigned in high school? I think it was assigned in my high school. This isn't
Sure
going
it
on
was.
like
Yeah.
30 years, but it was assigned in my high school, and I I remember not liking reading it, because I, like many Black people, I think my age, was the only Black kid in class, and there was a lot of like, well, Deborah understands this. There was a lot of, I felt quite singled out in a way that was, yeah, it was dehumanizing. Um,
Yeah.
but should that book not be taught? Like, no, just teach it well, just teach it, learn how to teach books well. I think that there's a conversation to be had even about books that we generally would not characterize as literature that we want our high school students to engage with. And of course, there's just limited time in the curriculum. Um, but I think that there's a conversation to be had about all books of all kinds. I don't know, Lawrence, what's your take?
A slightly different take. I have read the book a few times, including more recently, because I've sometimes written about it for the Globe and Mail and other publications. So I needed to keep rereading it. I mean, I of course I think there's. It sounds very self-serving, but of course I think there's a profound difference between the use of the word, say, in the Book of Negroes and The Kill a Mockingbird. For one thing, The Kill a Mockingbird does not have a single Black character with any dimensionality. To Kill a Mockingbird is a book about white people observing and thinking about racism. And it's obviously set in Alabama in the 1930s, and it has nothing to do with Canada. And of course, the teaching of it perpetually. Every one of my 5 children was asked to read that book in high school. And in the course of that year of study, it was the only book that in any way pretended to explore issues of racism. So a white writer writing about racism in Alabama in the 1930s is not on, in my opinion, especially because it's a book that has no dimensional Black characters. In the ones that do show up are entirely flat and really unexamined. And so, maybe with a tiny exception of Calpurnia. So, uh, I, I don't have a problem with the book itself. I have a problem with its teaching because historically, teachers leaned on, oh, this will be the book that we use to introduce the concepts of racism to our children. I'd much rather have a Black Canadian writer, being read in Canadian high schools, writing about. It's not that they have to be contemporary issues, but from a Black perspective, if they're writing about Black people, and especially because To Kill a Mockingbird has no dimensional Black characters, and so it's very flat at that end. Is it brilliantly written? Yes. If you want to understand the depiction of Black people in literature and also American literature, of course you need to read the book. Any student of literature should read that book. It's a necessary acquisition, if you're learning about American literature and so forth. But I think it's been overused and kind of lazily used in high schools, and so I think it should be left on the shelf and people should continue to read it. But there are better books to assign. And I would, if you're assigning one, I'd assign one by a Black Canadian writer.
Yeah, To Kill a Mockingbird enables uh it enables like a discussion or an understanding of racism whereby racism is, extraordinary violence, it is segregation, it is in the past, it is in the US South, and it's like
Exactly.
that picture of racism that then becomes embedded in people's minds as what real racism is, and allows folks to dismiss the very real racism that Black folks in Canada experience.
Exactly. It allows for the quintessential burying of our heads in the sand with regard to the reality of Black people here in this country. So that's my hang up with the teaching of it. I think the book should be read, but I don't think it should be relied on so heavily by teachers.
Great answer. And we'll take another question.
Okay, the next question, somebody says, I work in a school board that has banned any books that use derogatory language or racial epithets. That means we cannot read the Book of Negroes or watch Desmond Cole's The Skin I'm In, but it goes further. We can't teach Mouse, Persepolis, Night, Only Drunks and Children Tell the Truth, and many more texts. This has resulted in the voices of those who have been historically marginalized being further marginalized. The board's position is that the harm that the language could potentially cause to one student is the only reason needed to justify why the book should not be used. How can we balance the need to protect students from potentially harmful language in literature with the importance of exposing them to diverse voices and perspectives, particularly those of historically marginalized communities?
Well,
Lawrence, this one is
it's
all
ludicrous. It's ludicrous to think that you're protecting students from harm by preventing them from reading books and from having them assigned to be read by classes. Come on. Do you think that a student who's listened to the word on the radio on the way to school and seen it on TV on the way home is suddenly protected from harm because for 1 hour in class the book was they were reading a book that contained the word? It's a total misreading of the experiences of young people, and basically it suggests that something that's a fact in their lives outside the classroom cannot be discussed in the classroom because somehow we're deluding ourselves into thinking we're protecting them from harm. The harm is in preventing students from having conversations they can probably only have in school, and from preventing teachers from approaching these issues. If we do not equip students with the ability to navigate harmful subjects, painful subjects, then we're not really equipping them for adult life. And we're also barring them from access to literature by racialized writers and frankly by writers representing queer culture.
cosign. Yes, absolutely. I agree 100% with everything that you said, Lawrence. And I feel like that is a sufficient response to that question and problem. And to all the teachers in the audience, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that this is the situation that you find yourselves in. Teaching is such an admirable profession, and I'm sorry that it's so hard to do the right thing in these complicated times.
I'm sorry too, and really, the teachers need to be. They do amazing work. They need to be backed up by their principals and by their school board superintendents and by people who lead provincial ministries or departments of education. They need to be supported and backed up and encouraged to teach these books rather than left in the wind and suspended with pay because they had the courage to teach books that students need to read.
And we will take another question.
Okay, the next question, somebody says, clearly banning the word doesn't end racism or prepare schools to handle it. I'm wondering if there's a pathway to support teachers, schools to build enough awareness to deal with white students asking their Black classmates for N-word passes.
Is that like a race card? Like you give someone
It's like permission. It's like, can
permission?
I say this word? Do you give me permission to say this word? I'm a white student. Could you please give me permission to use this word? Of course, that's ridiculous. You know,
Yeah, your Black friend is not king of Black people. They don't get
right?
to give out
Yeah,
those passes.
exactly. It's not a monarchy, and you, you just shouldn't be. Come on, like in a public setting, I don't really care what you do in private. When you're walking with your friend to the bus and you're having conversations, none of my business the language that you're using and the ways you're talking with a trusted friend in a private setting. I don't want to police private conversations. I have no business policing that. But we all know that there's certain words and turns of phrases that could be incredibly offensive to some people that we shouldn't be using, you know, with our grandmothers or in church or in a synagogue or in the school classroom. We just don't, or in a mosque, we just don't do that. And common sense tells us that. So we need to sort of be relatively civil and polite. We don't have to be, absolutely arch conservative, but relatively civil and polite in the language that we choose to use in public settings so that we can get along and get to difficult issues without offending each other.
I don't know a ton about teacher education or the continuing education that I think teachers might have to do. But for me, to speak of what pathways there are for teachers to educate themselves, I believe that we will have a list of readings that we like at the end of this or on the website. And if there's not, we will make one. I'm happy to share my syllabi. I'm happy to give anyone who's listening a list of the things that I assign in my classroom, because by the time I really do feel that, a lot of my students walk in my classroom not knowing very much about racism in the Canadian context and walk out being able to have these conversations in a really sophisticated, smart, uh, empathetic way. And so as I said earlier, like this is within the possibility of things that one can learn if you are willing to do the work in the reading.
And some school boards are very good at offering professional development and teaching opportunities for teachers to learn how to navigate and to teach difficult texts. And some school boards are completely remiss and have not been providing, professional development along these lines to the teachers to equip them with the training that they need in order to teach these texts responsibly and thoughtfully. And so, again, this is a question of board leadership. We can't ask a teacher to do everything. Teachers also need to be trained and retrained and helped along through professional development. Come on, I mean, we ask other professionals to engage regularly in professional development to keep their licenses. Teachers also have to engage in professional development, so some of it must be geared toward the challenges of teaching challenging literature. And school boards have to offer that and offer it more vigorously.
If there are any school board administrators who happen to be listening right now, I would be happy to run my course on Zoom for any teachers who want to learn. That'd be super easy, super fun, no problem. We will do the politics of race in Canada for anyone who wants to learn. Don't tell McGill, but no problem. And I believe we have time for one more question, which is very sad. This time has just flown by.
Yeah, this ties in actually to what you were just talking about. What is the best way to support educators who are and want to teach books that have words like the N-word or about sensitive topics subject to be banned? What can administrators do to support these educators?
Well, they can engage in professional development. They can invite in people who know a lot about these issues to present. Some school boards, and I believe one example would be the Peel District School Board, have done a significant amount of work in this respect. So school boards should be confident enough to reach out to other school boards to ask to learn about the materials that they have developed so that they can be shared and learned. So school boards have to do the work too to bring in experts to help guide teachers and train them and offer professional development in these subjects. Whether there are lots of people around who can talk about these issues and guide teachers towards how to teach these books effectively, and so it should be offered through training regularly, to teachers.
If I could add to that, so some of what we've seen in school board elections across the country in recent years is not just random folks who want to ban books that about trans people. It's not random. It's quite coordinated. It's organized. And for those of us who perhaps believe in more progressive values, we also need to get organized to counter some of the forces of regressive politics, which are going to dominate both the United States and probably this country for the next 4 to 5 years. So if you are in Ontario, vote. Please do not have a voter turnout like the last Ontario election, which was something like 33%. If you are a Canadian citizen, please vote in the upcoming federal election. Know the issues. And after the elections are over, that is not the end of the political realm. There are lots of ways for folks to get involved with communities, with nonprofits, at various levels of organizing, because we cannot let the forces of authoritarianism and regressive politics dominate and erode our democracy. It's so important to organize, mobilize.
I
Lawrence,
agree.
we are basically out of time. I was wondering if you would like to if you have any concluding thoughts before we call Jim back into the Zoom room.
Well, it's been fabulous to chat with you, Deborah. I will say that I don't know if I might add another note to the last or the second to last question, and that was that teachers and school boards and administrators should reach out to Black educators, who do teach these books, who are in favor of teaching these books, who know how to teach these books, and ask for guidance. And so you can do lots of research on your own, but you should reach out to colleagues and others who can provide guidance, who are experts in these areas and who've done it, as particularly Black educators and writers who can provide guidance on these issues. So don't go it alone. Look for advice from people who know what they're talking about.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Jim. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It was just a staggeringly good conversation between the two of you. We're really honored to have had you, and I want to thank you so much for doing that. I want to thank the audience for so many good questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There were two questions that were not, well, I guess the first thing I say is Lawrence, you talked about the need for professional development. The sad thing is that there's lots of professional development. It just isn't addressed to these kinds of questions often enough. So it's not the absence of professional development. Teachers have professional development days, they have extra qualification courses, all sorts of things. This is an issue broadly in terms of the increasing demands for censorship. And it really is the school libraries and curriculum materials are becoming more of the focus than public libraries these days. I think there's a lot of fear about opposition in the community, about angry parents, and so they try to avoid it, which only makes matters worse. So I really appreciate your suggestion that they bring into the professional development days educators, Black educators or Indigenous educators who deal with these issues and can give them some advice. And a major focus of the Center for Free Expression for the next 2 or 3 years is going to be helping schools and school boards and teacher librarians deal with these issues and create resources, because this is the number of parents' rights groups and other groups challenging what's in schools, especially books on racism or LGBTQ friendly books or books about sex education or trans, are under fierce attack. And it's going to be, so we're really grateful for what you had to say. There was a question that asked about the London District Catholic School Board, which banned the book, inviting you in to address them. But more broadly, I assume they haven't. Is that correct, Lawrence?
No, they have not. I did offer to go for free and speak, but no, I haven't been invited.
We did get a letter from, I just want to make clear, the Center for Free Expression got a letter from an official in the board asking why we had the title we did about being banned, since the book is available in their library. And I wrote back to them, well, the fact is you banned teachers from using it in the curriculum. And I would be happy if you wanted to send us something I could read about your position. I would share that with the audience, and they have not, they've declined to do that. The last question, there are a number of people who asked about, is a video of this going to be available? And it will be. A video of this discussion will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow, probably by early afternoon at the latest. So I'd really encourage any of you who found this valuable, would like to share it with your colleagues who'd like to use it or parts of it in PD days or whatever, to take advantage of that. And as Debra mentioned, one of the things we always do with each of our programs and each of our videos is we put a list of resources for those who want to dig more into this. And so Debra mentioned several things, Lawrence mentioned several things. They'll be there, links to their books will be there, links to other readings that go deeper into these issues. So that will be posted along with the video by tomorrow afternoon. So you'll have access both to the video and to those additional resources. Finally, I'd like to tell you about our next event, which is going to be 2 weeks from tonight, Wednesday, June 26th. And it's going to be on the same topic in a broad sense. It's going to be about banning books in schools. Our guest is going to be Ira Wells, who teaches at the University of Toronto and is the author of a brand new book that's being published actually the day before our event. It's entitled On Banning Books, or How the New Censorship Consensus trivializes art, and undermines democracy. So those of you who were engaged in this wonderful discussion tonight, I'd encourage you to come to that next 2 weeks today, the 26th of February at 7 p.m. And if you want any more information about our other events, which relate to these and conjoint issues, go to our website, which is cfe.torontomu.ca. So again, thanks to all of you for participating. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Everyone.